Orson Welles was a man who refused to follow the rules. At just 24, he created a story so bold that it enraged the most powerful man in America. They tried to stop it, using newspapers, threats, and even the FBI to silence him. But Welles fought back in his own way. He filled his work with hidden messages, leaving clues for anyone willing to look deeper. What was Welles really trying to say? Keep watching to uncover the secrets he left behind. Orson Welles was born on May 6, 1915, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, into a family that seemed extraordinary from the start. His father, Richard Welles, was a successful inventor who made a fortune creating a special bicycle lamp and running wagon factories. His mother, Beatrice, was a concert pianist with a sharp mind and unexpected skills, like being an excellent rifle shooter. Even as a baby, Orson was seen as exceptional. At just 18 months, a family friend, Dr. Maurice Bernstein, called him a genius. By the time he was 2, he was speaking with a maturity far beyond his years. By 3, he was discussing topics most adults struggled with. His mother avoided children's books, instead reading him Shakespeare and classic poetry before he could even walk properly. When Orson discovered he was reading simplified versions of Shakespeare, he demanded the originals. At 5, he attended a Stravinsky concert and amazed adults with his understanding of music. People in Kenosha whispered that he was so unusual he might be some kind of witch. Orson also had a mischievous side. At just 3 years old, he faked appendicitis to avoid kindergarten, saying he wouldn't waste time with children whose biggest dream was to become Boy Scouts. But this unusual and privileged childhood didn't last. In 1924, just after Orson's 9th birthday, his mother, Beatrice, died from hepatitis. Her death shattered him. She had been the guiding force in his life, introducing him to music, literature, and art, and preparing him for a future she believed would be exceptional. Her loss ended his musical training and left him feeling untethered. 6 years later, tragedy struck again. Orson's father, Richard, had struggled to cope after losing Beatrice. He turned to alcohol and began dragging Orson on chaotic trips to places like Jamaica and the Far East. Their relationship grew tense, and by 15, Orson refused to see his father unless he stopped drinking. They never made amends. On December 28, 1930, Richard died alone in a hotel room in Chicago. Orson was racked with guilt over their last fight, later saying, "That was the last I ever saw of him. I don't want to forgive myself." After his father's death, Dr. Maurice Bernstein, the same man who had called Orson a genius as a baby, became his guardian. Bernstein was deeply invested in Orson's development, often promoting his talents through newspapers and arranging for him to meet specialists who worked with gifted children. But not all these experiences were positive. One meeting ended abruptly when the psychologist made inappropriate advances toward Orson. This left him with a deep mistrust of authority figures and may have contributed to his later habit of exaggerating or reimagining his childhood. At just 16 years old, Orson Welles set out on an extraordinary journey to Ireland in August 1931. With $500 of inheritance money, he bought a donkey and cart, traveling through the countryside he described as a lost Eden, full of beauty and romance. His adventure took a bold turn when he arrived at Dublin's Gate Theatre. He boldly claimed to be a star of the New York Theatre Guild. The story was completely made up, but his confidence worked. The theater gave him a chance, and he ended up performing in 5 plays, including Jew Sus and Hamlet. His acting was raw and inexperienced, but it showed flashes of brilliance. One of the theater's founders described his performance as chaotic, but full of the qualities of a great actor. During his time in Dublin, Welles also started writing a theater column for a local paper under a fake name, Knowles Noel Shane, showing his flair for creativity even off the stage. By 19, Welles had made it to Broadway. He played Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet, but it was his next role in a play called Panic that changed his life. The play's producer, John Houseman, saw something special in Welles and insisted on casting him in the lead role, even though the part was written for a much older man. The play only ran for 3 nights, but it sparked a partnership between Houseman and Welles that would shape Welles's future. Houseman later said that Welles was like the teacher, and he was the student, a rare dynamic for someone so young. In 1937, Welles and Houseman took a huge risk. With only $100 between them, they founded the Mercury Theater. Their first production was Julius Caesar, but it wasn't the version people expected. Welles set the play in a modern fascist Italy, drawing parallels to the rise of dictators like Mussolini. The production was a hit, gaining attention for its bold vision. The Mercury Theater quickly expanded into radio, where Welles pushed boundaries again. Their show, The Mercury Theater on the Air, used creative sound effects and music to bring stories to life. At first, the show didn't get much attention. That all changed on October 30th, 1938. Their broadcast of War of the Worlds was so realistic that thousands of listeners thought Earth was under attack by Martians. The panic made headlines across the country, and Welles became an overnight sensation. Welles's sudden fame caught Hollywood's attention. RKO Pictures wanted this 24 years old badly, but Welles wasn't in a rush to accept. He cleverly used his hesitation to get a better deal, once saying, "If you honestly didn't want to go," the deals got better and better. On August 21st, 1939, he finally signed a deal that stunned Hollywood. The contract guaranteed $100,000 for his first film, plus 20% of profits once RKO recouped $500,000 and $125,000 for a second film. For a young, unproven filmmaker, this was unheard of, and the Hollywood press had a field day mocking both Welles and RKO. What really set the contract apart wasn't the money, though. It was the creative control. Welles had complete freedom, something no director had ever been given. No studio executives could see the footage until he allowed it, and no one could make edits without his approval. Welles called it total control, and later said, "Financially, it wasn't extraordinary. It was extraordinary in the control it gave me as a director." He could choose the story, the cast, the crew, and even have the final say on how the movie was edited. When he arrived at RKO in July 1939, he compared the studio to the greatest electric train set a boy ever had, showing his excitement to experiment freely. Welles's first project at RKO was an ambitious adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He wanted to film it entirely from the protagonist's point of view, something no one had done before. He wrote a detailed 174-page script, created storyboards, and even scouted locations. One of his ideas was to show civilization falling apart as the story moved upriver, with elaborate fire scenes and hundreds of extras. Even the strict Hays Code censors approved his plans. But everything changed when World War II began. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the project lost its chance at European distribution. RKO slashed the budget from $1 million to $500,000. But even then, they pulled the plug in March 1940. Welles had offered to direct another film for free to save it, but it wasn't enough. With Heart of Darkness canceled, Welles started working on Citizen Cain. In late 1939, he teamed up with Herman Mankiewicz to create the script. They spent hours brainstorming, often with Welles sitting by Mankiewicz's bedside while he recovered from a broken leg. They decided to base the story on William Randolph Hearst, the powerful newspaper magnate. The partnership wasn't smooth, though. Mankiewicz worked on the script, but began to demand credit, which caused a major fight. He threatened to expose the situation to the press unless he was properly recognized. Eventually, in January 1941, RKO gave both Welles and Mankiewicz joint credit, though Welles insisted Mankiewicz's name appear first on the script. Apart from that, Welles formed an unexpected partnership with one of Hollywood's greatest cinematographers, Gregg Toland. Toland approached Welles with a surprising reason for wanting to work with him. "You've never made a picture before. You don't know what cannot be done." Toland, who had just won an Oscar for Wuthering Heights, taught Welles everything he needed to know about cinematography in just 36 hours. Welles also made bold decisions when choosing the cast. Instead of hiring famous Hollywood stars, he selected actors from his Mercury Theater group, many of whom had little or no film experience. This allowed him to shape their performances without clashing with big personalities. Joseph Cotten and Agnes Moorehead, who later became stars, were among these newcomers. Alan Ladd, though uncredited, even had a small role as a reporter. To portray the characters aging over decades, the cast underwent extensive makeup sessions, with some actors spending up to 6 hours in the chair. Welles himself had to arrive on set at 5 a.m. for old age makeup, in scenes showing Cain's later years. The production wasn't without its struggles. Welles had to outsmart the studio, RKO, to maintain creative control. He pretended he was filming camera tests, while actually shooting scenes for the movie. RKO wanted him to focus on a project called The Men from Mars, based on his radio fame, but Welles secretly worked on his own vision instead. Although the budget surpassed $500,000, forcing him to negotiate for approvals, Welles managed to keep much of his control. The movie Citizen Cain tells its story in a very unusual way. Instead of one person explaining who Charles Foster Cain was, 5 different people share their memories of him, and their stories don't always match. A reporter, Thompson, talks to people who knew Cain well. He speaks with Cain's guardian, Mr. Thatcher, his business manager, Mr. Bernstein, his best friend, Jedediah Leland, his second wife, Susan Alexander, and his butler, Raymond. Each of them sees Cain in a different way. Thatcher thinks Cain was rebellious and destructive. Bernstein believes he was a visionary. Leland remembers him as someone who started with good intentions, but lost his way. Susan describes him as controlling and cruel, while Raymond talks about his sadness and loneliness at the end of his life. This way of telling the story, showing so many different perspectives, was something no movie had done before. It also jumps back and forth in time, making the audience piece everything together, almost like solving a puzzle. Mirrors are a big part of the movie and show how Cain's identity was broken into many pieces. One of the most memorable scenes happens after Susan leaves him. Cain walks through a hallway full of mirrors, and his reflection repeats over and over, getting smaller and darker each time until it disappears. This scene was made using 27 mirrors, with careful lighting to keep the camera from showing up in the reflections. It's like each mirror represents a different part of Cain, all leading to nothingness. Another important moment with mirrors happens in the Thatcher Library, where the reporter's reflection splits into 3 parts. This shows how hard it is to find one true version of Cain. There are 47 scenes with mirrors in the movie, and each one adds something to the story about who Cain really was. One of the biggest mysteries in the movie is Cain's final word, rosebud. The word is mentioned several times, as people try to figure out what it means. The answer doesn't come until the very end. In the final scene, workers at Cain's mansion are burning some of his belongings, and we see a sled with the name Rosebud on it. It's the sled Cain had as a child, and it represents the simple, happy life he had before everything became so complicated. What makes this interesting is that no one in the movie ever finds out what Rosebud means. It's a secret only the audience knows. The sled used in the movie was one of 3 made, and one of them was later sold at an auction for a lot of money. The movie also makes a bold political statement. It was inspired by the life of William Randolph Hearst, a powerful newspaper owner. Cain's run for governor in the movie is similar to Hearst's real-life attempt to become governor in 1906. Cain's mansion, Xanadu, is based on Hearst's castle, San Simeon. Even Cain's relationship with his second wife, Susan, mirrors Hearst's relationship with actress Marion Davies. There are also hints about politics and power, like a scene at Cain's political rally, which looks a lot like real-life rallies from fascist leaders. But Hearst didn't take this lightly. What angered him most was how the film portrayed Marion Davies, his longtime companion. In the movie, the character based on her, Susan Alexander, was shown as a bad opera singer with no talent. This was far from the truth. Davies was a successful actress, and Hearst had spent years helping her career. At his grand estate, San Simeon, where Hollywood stars often visited, even mentioning Orson Welles or the film became forbidden. Hearst's frustration was summed up in something he once said about newspapers. "You can crush a man with journalism, and you can't with motion pictures." He was about to prove just how true that was. Hearst went to extreme lengths to stop Citizen Cain from being seen. He persuaded some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including Louis B. Mayer, to try and buy the film so they could destroy it. When that failed, Hearst's team turned their focus to Welles himself. They accused the young filmmaker of being a communist, pointing to his involvement in political groups and charities. The FBI even began investigations, spurred on by Hearst's powerful connections in Washington. It wasn't just about the film anymore, it was about ruining Welles's career. At the same time, Hearst used his media empire to block the film's success. His newspapers, read by millions of Americans, refused to mention Citizen Cain. Instead, they printed stories attacking Welles, questioning his patriotism and hinting at hidden scandals. Hearst even threatened to reveal damaging secrets about Hollywood studios if they supported the film. These tactics worked. Many theaters were too afraid to show the film, and Citizen Cain struggled to make money. Even though it was nominated for 9 Oscars, it won just 1 for Best Original Screenplay. When Welles's name was mentioned at the awards ceremony, the audience booed. Afterward, the studio quietly shelved the movie, and it was largely forgotten for over 20 years. Despite Hearst's efforts, Citizen Cain eventually found its place in history. When it was rediscovered decades later, critics hailed it as one of the greatest films ever made. Its groundbreaking techniques in storytelling and cinematography changed filmmaking forever. Ironically, Hearst's campaign to destroy the film only proved its message: the dangers of unchecked power and ambition. Today, Citizen Cain is remembered not just as a masterpiece, but as a testament to the power of art to survive, even against the strongest opposition. After the success of Citizen Cain, Orson Welles started working on The Magnificent Ambersons in October 1941. The project had a budget of $853,950, and Welles brought his unique style to the film. He built the Amberson mansion set like a real house, with movable walls to allow smooth, continuous shots. But the production went over budget by 19%. The real problems began during editing in 1942, When Welles left for Brazil to work on another film, It's All True. While he was away, RKO took control of Amberson's and made huge changes. They cut more than 40 minutes of footage and spent $104,164 to add a happier ending, which completely changed the tone of the film. Even Bernard Herrmann, the composer, was so angry about changes to his music that he asked to have his name removed from the credits. To make things worse, RKO destroyed all the cut footage to save vault space, meaning Welles's original version was lost forever. This marked the start of Welles's struggles with Hollywood studios. At first, he had an incredible contract that gave him full creative control, but the industry quickly turned against him. Studios resented his power, and the press often mocked him. Over time, his creative freedom was taken away. For example, Universal International forced him off Touch of Evil in 1958 before he could finish editing it. Welles wrote a 58-page memo explaining how the film should be cut, but the studio ignored it. Other projects fell apart, too. His adaptation of Heart of Darkness was canceled when its budget doubled, and The Way to Santiago was abandoned after losing support from RKO. By 1947, Welles had enough. Frustrated with Hollywood and fearing he might be called to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he moved to Europe. The FBI had been watching him since Citizen Cain, accusing him of being a communist after he angered William Randolph Hearst. Orson Welles' love life was as wild as his movies. He married Virginia Nicholson in 1934 when he was only 19. But even while she was pregnant with their child, Welles started having affairs with other women, including actresses Geraldine Fitzgerald and Dolores Del Rio. The marriage ended in 1940. A few years later, in 1943, he married Rita Hayworth after seeing her picture on a Life magazine cover. They had a daughter named Rebecca, but their relationship didn't last. Welles couldn't stay faithful, having flings with Gloria Vanderbilt and Judy Garland. They divorced in 1948. In 1955, Welles married again. This time it was Paola Mori, an Italian aristocrat. He married her because she was pregnant, but they didn't stay together for long. Later in his life, he began a relationship with Croatian actress Oja Kodar, who was much younger than him. They stayed together for 24 years, even though Welles never divorced Mori. One of the most surprising parts of his love life was only revealed later. He had a son with Geraldine Fitzgerald, named Sir Michael Lindsay Hogg. Welles never publicly admitted this during his lifetime. Welles also had serious money problems. By 1947, he owed a huge amount in taxes, over $300,000, which would be millions today. To escape the debt, he moved to Europe, taking whatever acting jobs he could find to fund his films. He was bad with money, and often started movies without having enough funds to finish them. For example, his film Othello took 4 years to complete because he kept running out of cash. To keep going, Welles had to take acting roles to pay for filming. Things got so bad that he once accidentally registered an actress he was dating instead of marrying her because he didn't understand the Italian paperwork. By the 1970s, Welles had to do commercials to make money. He promoted products like Paul Masson Wine Japanese whiskey and even frozen peas. He didn't like doing it, but it paid well. For the Paul Masson ads alone, he earned $500,000 a year. Even though he joked about being the most infamous pitchman in booze history, his commercials became iconic and boosted sales for the companies. Welles was difficult to work with. He wanted everything to be perfect and often clashed with others. During The Lady from Shanghai, he made Rita Hayworth cut and bleach her famous red hair, which confused audiences and hurt the movie's success. On commercial sets, he often insulted directors and even extras. Once, while filming a Paul Masson wine ad, he appeared drunk, which caused a lot of trouble. Despite this, Welles defended himself, saying Hollywood was like a factory, and he was someone who didn't fit the system. In his later years, Welles became known for his commercials. He didn't think much of the products, calling Paul Masson wine a pleasant little cheap wine, but he earned a lot of money from the ads. His last public appearance was on The Merv Griffin Show, where he talked about Rita Hayworth and called her extraordinary. Just 2 hours later, Welles passed away at the age of 70. Welles spent much of his life in Europe, trying to escape financial trouble and make his films. His time in Italy was especially chaotic. He fell in love with actress Lea Padovani and had to throw out most of his Othello footage after their breakup. Critics in Italy weren't kind to him, calling him egotistical and overly dramatic. He had big plans during this time, like adapting Catch-22 and filming Treasure Island. But most of these projects never happened. Still, some of his most creative work came from his years in Europe, even if many of his films were left unfinished. He returned to America in 1970, but kept close ties to Europe, especially through his relationship with Oja Kodar.